So the UK's new energy bill, which is currently passing through Parliament, allows for the creation of criminal offences for a failure essentially to be energy efficient. So people are worried that possibly homeowners, business owners, landlords, etc., could be fined up to £15,000 and perhaps even jailed for a year for a failure to have the right energy efficiency standards in their property. Now, Tom, the government is saying it has no plans to use these powers, but still the direction of travel that this reveals is very worrying, isn't it?
It is, and I think we've been heading in this direction for a long time. I mean, if anyone thinks that this is entirely new ground, hasn't really been paying attention as far as fining people for their supposedly sinful environmental ways, has been around for quite a long time. I mean, if you think about ULEZ and its predecessors, if you think about any of the new schemes that are kind of coming in, even reports years ago about people being fined for not recycling and so on, like there's been this petty authoritarianism which has come along with the climate movement for quite a while. And I think the other thing that we're seeing is, because two things have always been true in the climate discussion, one of which is you ask people in general, are you concerned about the environment? And they'll say yes, as most people would.
Yeah.
But as soon as you say, should your lives get worse in order to meet these lofty climate goals which have been set from on high, should you have to pay for it? Should people have, like you have to put up with more expensive energy bills, with a less comfortable, less convenient life? People, understandably, I think, say no. Because the whole deal in politics is that you vote for political parties that will make your lives better. You expect your children's lives to be better than your lives. It kind of breaks that whole contract in a very meaningful sense. And so what we're seeing more explicitly is the environmental movement can't really convince people to have to put up with less.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to compel. They're going to have to force. And I think this is, as you say, we shouldn't be getting carried away in suggesting that, again, people are having their collars felt for turning the heating up too high or anything like that. But as you say, the direction of travel is pretty clear. And I think it all comes back to that simple point, which is that people are simply not convinced that their lives should get worse in an attempt to meet climate targets, which even if they were completely successful on their own terms, if you think about the size of Britain and the rest of the world and so on, would have absolutely zero difference on the picture in general. So I think that's just the rubber's hitting the road now.
Yeah.
That is concerned, I guess.
And it is worth restating that, the Public Accounts Committee has said in Parliament that over 60% of all the emissions cuts in the UK to reach net zero will come from behaviour change, not from new technologies. So, there are all kinds of problems with wind farms and solar panels, but even if you put those aside, net zero does not mean shiny new solar panels appearing everywhere, new nuclear power stations. It doesn't just mean that. It means your life is going to have to change, your behaviour is going to have to change. And as this bill suggests, if you don't do it voluntarily, you'll be pushed. But what do you make of that aspect of it?
I think it's part of what I think is a worrying trend across, certainly in Britain and to a certain degree America as well, as we see, which is that we're seeing political differences, and particularly certain people looking at political opponents as near criminals, almost. That instead of, as once upon a time I think we did, articulating those differences and having a proper Barney about them and having a discussion and protesting if you wanted to protest and whatever. Nowadays, it seems that some people think, because you don't hold the same opinion as me, on net zero or whatever, and because that opinion is so clearly morally virtuous, and these people are full of their own kind of moral rectitude, that they can't comprehend that somebody else might not share that opinion. Yeah. And if they don't share that opinion, then somehow they're morally inferior and they're bordering on criminal. And I think we saw that a little bit with Brexit and the fallout from that, where you saw some people on the Remain side of the argument actively and publicly saying that politicians and campaigners on the Leave side should be locked up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did see people articulating that seriously. They should be locked up for their lives. We're seeing the thing with Trump in America at the moment. I mean, I'm certainly not a fan of Donald Trump at all. I'm distinctly wary about what's going on, and the fact that somebody who clearly has a degree of popularity, somebody who's planning to run for president again, could find himself on the inside of a prison cell by political opponents, I think many of whom clearly are politically motivated. I mean, that said, Trump doesn't really help himself, because it was he, of course, who was saying about Hillary Clinton, lock her up and stuff like that. So he as an individual probably can't complain very much about that. But I do think that this tendency to say that, you must be bordering on criminal because you don't agree with me is something that's escalating a little bit within society. I think there's much broader questions, actually, about energy security. We could debate that all night, how we, as an advanced Western nation, simply do not have energy independence. We don't have energy security. Our energy supply is an absolute shambles, frankly. And what we're going to achieve in terms of net zero, when you look at the carbon emissions of places like China and the US, you have to conclude, I certainly have to conclude, that what we're demanding really amounts to no more than posturing, because in terms of actual effect, it's clearly going to be minimal. But nonetheless, it seems to me it's about politicians being able to preen and posture on the world stage and saying, look what we've achieved, even though it's possibly going to impoverish millions of people. So that debate needs to be had as well within this context, sure.
Yeah, the posturing is interesting because the politicians are quite open about that. They say Britain must be a world leader in net zero. We'll make the sacrifices. Others will see how brilliant it is and will step into line. Tom, do you think the sort of apocalypticism of climate change, the climate movement, has a role to play in here? Because, obviously, if you do think that people are literally killing the planet by leaving the heating on a bit too long, or washing their clothes too many times, then presumably you do think, well, yeah, why not put them in prison?
And what I think is interesting about the public bristling against these kinds of policies, whether you see that in relation to ULEZ, whether you see that just in relation to kind of polling on net zero in general, I think it's shown that people don't buy the apocalypticism. If the public bought the extreme rhetoric that you get out of places like the UN, we're talking about whether it's global boiling or code red for humanity, the rhetoric getting almost absurdly apocalyptic, as you say, because they feel like the plebs just aren't listening, so we've got to keep, for lack of a better phrase, turning up the temperature. People obviously don't buy it, because if you believed this, as your average Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion person was, you would be turning your heating off and gluing yourself to the tarmac. People don't believe it. People don't buy it. It's not to say they're not concerned about climate change, or they don't think we should make sure that our energy policy is not wantonly polluting or whatever. It's just to say they clearly do not buy the thing that's been sold to them. They've intuited quite rightly that this is become a bizarre preoccupation of a political elite, particularly on the global stage, which really sees this more as a moral mission more than a kind of clear-cut, technical, practical problem to be overcome. And I think on Paul's point as well, the preening and the posturing aspect of it is so interesting, because it's just another example, as you get on so many other issues, in which politicians seem to derive so much of their authority, their worth, from going to some kind of international conference and being applauded, rather than serving the people who elected them well. This is such a great example of it, because what the policies that they're imposing on people will make their lives worse, will make things more expensive, will make things harder for them. And they're just saying they've got to suck it up because I've got to look good at COP29 or whatever it is going to be next year. I mean, it's a really fascinating example of how on this issue, but not exclusively on this issue, they've just become detached from what we used to call the kind of bread and butter concerns of the electorate, of keeping the lights on, of all these sorts of things that used to be so basic, have almost become up for negotiation in the midst of all of this. And I do think the other thing that it shows is that in the whole discussion around energy, we used to take as given that things like energy security, keeping the lights on, making sure that people can continue to enjoy increasingly plush lives as much as is possible, was the goal.
Yeah.
That's changed now in a very drastic way. The goal is conserving this abstract thing called the planet. And regardless of what other countries are doing, we just have to go along with it. And whether or not you're going to have to put up with being colder and poorer, that's just how it goes. So I think it's a reminder of how much, because environmentalism has become such a kind of ruling class ideology, kind of guiding ethic of theirs, it's upturned what we all thought the deal was to us and our politicians in quite a meaningful sense.